So I'm going to do a tutorial today on how I make my Millefiori stamps go together, those pieces. And I've got 5 Millefiori, has 5 sides, so you're doing the centers with 5 of these fat diamonds. And I like to fussy stamp a lot of my pieces, and then to sew them, we're only going to sew from corner to corner on the sewing lines. And I also take my stitch length down and I reverse back a couple stitches. You do not want to sew off with this stamp method because you want the pieces to spin to get the fabric out of the way. And so I'm going to sew my 5 pieces together. And because I fussy stamped them, then I'm going to place them exactly the right points that I want to go together to get them to look good. And I'll sew them into pairs first and then trim them and then sew those pairs together and keep adding pieces until the center comes together. So to one of the pairs, then I'm going to add my 5th piece. And what you're doing is you're pulling these seams out of the way, and you can feel where that seam is and pulled back, and you're lining up your edges and starting that next seam right where those seams are pulled back so that you're not going to catch that seam. And just sew to the corner, reverse back at the corners, and then again, pull those seams out of the way, and I'm going to add that other pair and line up the edges, pulling both sets of seams out of the way, and you can feel those seams nesting together there. And then they only have one more seam to do, and we're going to line up those edges, pull all those seams out of the way, and then trim all your threads. So we do this so that when you iron, all the seams will be ironed in a circular fashion because you've got several seams coming together, and then we'll press with the iron like that and iron them flat. So the next set that I'm going to put onto this to add for that block, these are what I call a long diamond, and those are going to go in here like this. And instead of sewing those in, then I'm going to first add my pentagon pieces, one to each side of this. And the same thing, everything is the same. You're going to match up those edges and I just pull my threads at that point, line up this one, make sure that this is lined up with that right there, and that seam is pulled to the back. Line up your edges, start, reverse back a couple stitches, and we reverse back to give it strength because we're going to be tugging as we spin those out of the way. And then when those are sewn on, what you're going to do is spin these 2 together, line up those edges, pull this seam to the outside so all those seams are out of the way, and this is what I call sewing the common seam. And I just stitch it forward a couple and back. And normally I would get all my pieces done to this point, but I'm going to show you how to add that next to the star center that we just made. So I'm going to fold again, get those seams out of the way, and you're going to line up this edge, that start. You can feel where you're supposed to start because that's folded and that's where that seam's going to end. And we're not going to pivot when we get to that point and spin it, because I want those, if you've pressed, you need to pull those seams out of the way, whichever direction you're going. So now I'm going to flip those seams back and then spin this one and do this seam separate. So this is going to allow all the seams to spin if you don't go over the top of the seams. And then those are pulled back, those seams pulled back. You've lined up your edges, and you're going to sew just to the end of the sewing line and reverse back. And you're going to do this on each of the pieces around, sewing those units and then sewing them to this. And then when you've done that, then you'll flip your common side seams of those units. And so after we've put that all together, then the next step is we're going to add stars. And how I make the stars is we're taking the tiny hexie, not hexie. We're going to take the tiny pentagon and create our stars. And so we've got 5 points that are going to go on to each one on each edge. And I like to just start mine and send them through. Same thing, always starting, centering on the sew line where they need to be. And I'm going to feed them through assembly line fashion and adding a star point to each edge. And keep going until I've got however many I need around the outside. So depending on where it goes in the quilt, they won't all get stars on the outside. Some of the edges may bed up to something else. So just keep adding those points, tucking those seams to the outside. So that seam here is to the outside. And I just sort of finger press them to the outside there, and then add my next piece, centering it, and you can feel where that starts because that seam's to the outside, and you can feel where it's going to start right where that seam is pulled to the outside. So we're sewing on the last star point, and it is centered in between those two seams that are pulled to the outside. And the next piece we're going to sew is we have another fat diamond, and they're the same size as the ones that were used in the center to start the block. And these are going to join up here like this, and you want to make sure that you've got those laid out, because if you lay them out wrong, see, that doesn't match and it'll pull these points together. So you want to make sure you're putting them into the star correctly. And you're just going to line up those edges, pull your seams to the outside, and you can feel where that's sitting against that seam that's pulled to the outside. Reverse back at the points. And so with this quilt, it works really good to sew things into units like this and not just add pieces as you go around. And it's much more efficient as well, but I think the points and everything on all the pieces come together better too. And seams to the outside. There you go. So then you're just going to trim. And then you're going to go back, and this one will be flipped. Line up those edges, pull those seams to the outside. You're always sewing every seam individually. That's what gives you the ability to spin those seams when we iron, and it gets the bulk of the fabric out of the way. And then just keep adding that piece and sewing, flipping seams to the outside. And then trimming your threads. So now you have 2 units that look like this, and these are ready to sew onto the bigger block that we started making. So what we're going to do is this is how it's going to sew on there. So I'm going to pull these seams to the outside, line up this edge. Make sure you start where that point is and those seams are to the outside. And line up the edges, pull these seams to the outside. And because so much of this is on the bias, make sure to not tug your fabric and overstretch it, or your seams won't line up. And then I'm going to just flip that to the side and sew my next star on. And you're sewing them on. So this is going to come down here. So this one's starting here. Seams to the outside, lining up your edges, reversing back. Same thing, pull these seams out. And then come back and trim threads. And so now we're going to flip this edge and pull that star around, pull those seams to the outside, and pull all these seams to the outside, and sew the other side of that star onto, and line up those points really good. So if it's getting stars all the way around, then I sew just like I did these two. I sew just the one side and then come back and I'm sewing the other side. And the reason why is it'll allow you to pull this and line up where that point is really good. So those points, all those seams are coming together at the same point. Pulling seams to the outside. So now you've got these pieces like this, and we're going to flip these seams and sew this seam, and then flip them and sew it out. So there's quite a few seams there, and it gets bulky, so you want to make sure you pull all those seams to the outside. Start at that point where they're coming together. And line this up and sew only to the edge of that. Trim those threads. Flip these two sides together here. Pull those seams to the outside. There you go. We've got 2 stars on the outer edge of the block.